Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today is the 26th day of Chanmas. That's a weird one to say, but I am so excited because today I'm going to be bringing you my most disappointing reads of 2021. It seems like a weird thing to get excited about, but some of these books it's going to be so cathartic to finally tell you about and tell you why they didn't work for me. Now, I'll preface this by saying that not all of these books were published in 2021. Some were published earlier, but I just happened to read them this year. If some of these books worked for you, I am so happy for you, but they just didn't work for me for whatever reason. Now, enough preamble, let me get into the 6 most disappointing books that I read this year. First up, we have The Heart Principle by Helen Hoang. This is a book about our main character, Anna, who is a violinist dealing with both anxiety and imposter syndrome, and it's also a story about our hero, Quan, who we learn about in some of the other books in this series. Now, I was warned before going into this book that it was going to be a different tone than some of the other rom-coms in this series. It's the 3rd book, it's the final book, and I was expecting something with a little bit more grit and maybe a little bit more depth, but I wasn't expecting a book of this caliber of sadness. This story really centers on Anna's journey as she caretakes for her dying father and also navigates her relationship with Quan, which, to be honest, was not exactly what I was looking for. And it's not that I don't think this book is important or that I don't think that these themes should be explored in a romance. I certainly think that they can be explored and explored well. But my issue is that the romance didn't add levity to a story that I think desperately needed it. And again, I don't think that all romances need to be this uplifting, bright thing, but I feel like if you're going to market a book as a romance, then you want to make sure that the romance is something that we can all root for. And unfortunately, I just didn't really root for Anna and Quan in this book. I feel like Quan was a completely different character than we had gotten to know in the previous books, and I feel like the trauma that was inflicted on Quan was unfortunately just a way to make him more relatable and seem like a better fit for Anna. And that sucks because I feel like his story was equally as important, and if we are going to give him hard things to deal with, I feel like he should be centered in the story as well. But he felt like a side character in his own romance, and overall this book just really disappointed me. Again, I think it's an important story and I definitely wouldn't tell people not to read this. I just think that it's important that you know going in what it is, and to me I really feel like this could have been better categorized as general fiction or women's fiction. It just didn't really hit the mark for me as a romance. Next up we have a book which is like my bad again at this point. I read this book on recommendation of a couple of my friends who absolutely loved this book, who think that this book is their favorite book of all time, and so I went into this book with really high expectations, and unfortunately those expectations were just not met, and that is The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin. This story is about 4 siblings who end up getting their fortunes told when they are pretty young, and they find out the age which they will die at. And they don't share the age that they got told that they would die at to their siblings, but they kind of hold this within themselves, and it impacts each of the different siblings differently. You know, there's varying ages at which they are predicted to die, and you know, some of them live fast, die young, some of them really make the most of the time that they have on Earth. And I wanted to like this book. I thought this was going to be this beautiful exploration of life and what it means, you know, to live to the fullest and, you know, all of the like cliche tropes and stuff. I was expecting that, but unfortunately it just did not deliver, and I honestly felt a little bit unsettled reading some of these storylines. Not only just unsettled, but also sort of depressed because none of the 4 siblings ended up having particularly interesting or fun lives. And it was weird because it's not like there was anything in their childhood to really make it to where they had trauma that they were working through or anything like that. It was just them getting themselves into trouble, I guess you could say. So that in and of itself was a little disappointing, and it didn't feel like I was learning lessons from any of the storylines, but on top of that, I felt like 2 of the storylines just didn't work on a technical level and also on a personal level. So one of our characters, the one that dies the youngest, is a gay man who ends up dying in the AIDS crisis. I am glad that this is being put into more stories. I feel like we don't learn enough about the AIDS crisis just in history in general, but also in fiction, so I was excited to see that explored, but I felt like that was not done very well. The character that ends up dying in the story is characterized as a very promiscuous person who couldn't possibly stay in a committed relationship. I'm not saying this wasn't the reality, but I feel like since we have so few stories like this out there that do center on a gay man during the AIDS crisis, I wanted personally for it not to fall into stereotypes, and I felt like it did, so that was pretty disappointing. And then I also feel like the storyline that follows one of our characters who ends up taking their own life, I don't feel like that mental health aspect of the story was explored particularly well, and it's disappointing because I feel like this story had so much promise and potential, and I was so curious to see how the different characters lived their lives, and I wanted there to be a strong message. But the message, I didn't seem to understand it, frankly. I ultimately just left a little bit sad and a whole lot not unsatisfied, so this was certainly a disappointing read for me. Next up is one that really, like, physically pains me to put on this list because it has everything that I would want from a story. It's sapphic, it's new adult, it's a bully romance. Like, say no more. I feel like that's my kind of story. But unfortunately, Tris 6 Venom by Penelope Douglas just really didn't deliver all that I wanted it to deliver. Again, I feel like I should have known better. I feel like this is my bad again. I have not had luck with the past couple of releases that Penelope Douglas has put out. I feel like this one, let me talk about the synopsis first and then I can kind of lead you into what didn't work. This book is about Clay and Olivia. Clay is the kind of good girl cheerleader and Olivia is from the wrong side of the tracks. Clay mostly bullies Olivia, although there is some Olivia on Clay bullying. They have this sort of like forbidden romance that happens, which sounds great. It sounds great. The romance itself was actually pretty good. I enjoyed their interactions. I liked how angsty and how smutty this book was, frankly. I feel like we don't get enough like truly smutty books in the sort of sapphic vein. But my issue with this book was the plotline. I feel like Penelope's books, unfortunately, have been getting kind of bloated in terms of page length. This one was over 500 pages, which is absolutely ridiculous for a romance, in my opinion. And on top of that, the plotline itself was very convoluted. It didn't add to the angst of the story, which is so disappointing because books like Punk 57, also written by this author, work so much better because they are a concise length. They have a plot that works with the characters rather than pulling your attention away from the characters. This one just didn't work for me as a book as a whole. I liked the romance aspect, but the plot, God, it just dragged me down. I did not care about this town. I did not care whether or not it got saved. It just didn't work for me, and I'm sad about it, and I'm hoping that the next Penelope Douglas book that I read is more in the vein of Punk 57 and Birthday Girl and, you know, is short and sweet and delightful. This one just didn't work for me, and while that sucks, I will still be reading more books from this author in the future. Okay, a book that you might be surprised that I read, but maybe not surprised that I'm putting it on this list, is Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare. I read Chain of Gold earlier this year, and I actually really enjoyed it, which is what spurred me to pick up this book. This story is about the kids of the Infernal Devices trilogy, and it's set in Victorian England. It's got typical monster chasing, Shadowhunter vibes, which I'm always here for. Honestly, I feel like Cassandra Clare is pretty good at this point at crafting a story, and I tend to fall hook, line, and sinker for her pretty consistent, like, tropey books. I'm into it, right? But I think my issue with this book is that it's something that we've seen time and time again, and yet it didn't have any sort of twist to it. Let me try to explain. So in the first book, we have a love triangle sort of situation going on. We really have sort of a forbidden romance between the main character and this girl. I guess they're both main characters. Let's just call them hero and heroine because it's easier for me that way. The hero and the heroine of the book, it's sort of a forbidden romance. She really likes him. He's uncertain about his feelings towards her. So we end that first book on a cliffhanger, and I was happy with it. I was excited to see if they would, you know, actually truly get together. And then in the second book, I keep wondering that. Like, they get together, and then, oh my god, they're forced apart for the same reason. It just didn't feel great. And you might say, who cares? Like, that's just the romantic component of the book. And that's true. I did like the whole knife-wielding murderer aspect of the book. I did think the plot of this one was fairly interesting. But when the romance is such a central component of these books, I am expecting something a little different every time. And this is just, like, it's Tessa and Will over again. And as interesting and fun as that was the first time, I'm not loving it a second time. I want there to be some sort of difference here. Maybe some polyamory instead of just a typical love triangle. Like, that option is there, and I don't think we're taking it. I digress. This book was fine. It wasn't the worst thing that I read this year. I think I gave it 3 stars, but I just wanted more from it. I wanted new and fresh plot, a new and fresh take on existing tropes, and I just didn't get that. Next up is a book that I had high expectations for, probably because of the marketing campaign around this book. I feel like I was absolutely bombarded with the marketing materials for The Ex-Hex by Erin Sterling. I've talked at length about this book. At this point, I don't want to harp on it anymore, but this is a small town witchy romance. It's supposed to be this sort of like second chance romance between this guy and this girl. The guy ends up breaking her heart because after like a few weeks that they spend together, kind of young and in love, he tells her that he is actually betrothed to someone, and she's upset about this. Rightfully so. A few years later, I think it's like 7 years or so, they come back together because I think Reese, the hero, is supposed to kind of preside over some sort of Halloween festivities in town, and our heroine like lives in the town she grew up in, and they kind of reunite, and I don't know. It's not an enemies to lovers situation, it's not a forbidden romance situation, it's just like a cut and dry second chance romance, but I just didn't believe in the romance. I felt like everything from the plot to the setting to the characters was just so flat. It just squandered the opportunity that you had. Like, the marketing, like I said, was so good. The synopsis really got me. I was so excited about it, but unfortunately that was it. Nothing was exciting beyond that initial synopsis. And after 100 pages, I ended up putting this book down. And that's kind of unheard of for me if I physically own a book. Like if I purchased a book, I'm gonna finish it. This one, I couldn't. So I feel like that says a lot about the quality. And if you loved it, I'm really happy for you. I know a lot of people did. It did not work for me. And then lastly, we have a book that was pretty surprisingly disappointing for me. This is a book, again, that was recommended by a couple of friends. And one of these friends, I feel like I tend to have pretty similar romance opinions too. So I was just so gearing up to like love this book, and I didn't love this book. In fact, I thought it was pretty not great, and that is Dreaming of You by Lisa Kleypas. I should have known that this was not going to be a book for me. I have not had the best luck with Lisa Kleypas, barring 2 series. Pretty much every book outside of those series I just haven't enjoyed, so I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. I really thought I'd like it. The makings of the story were pretty fantastic. We have our heroine Sarah, who writes a story about a sex worker, I believe. That's kind of like her thing, and she's become kind of renowned for the story that she writes, but she is sort of this like meek wallflower character from the country, and she doesn't really know how to write the sequel to the first book that she wrote. She needs what she thinks is some real life experience, so she travels to London and kind of goes around different gaming hells to sort of get a feel for what that life is like. And in the process, she meets this notorious, I don't even want to say rake, he owns a gambling hell. He basically went from a gutter to gambling hell, and he's kind of worked his way up to the top, which I tend to really like. I like a story where our hero kind of comes from nothing and sort of has a chip on his shoulder because of it, but this just did not work for me. I think the main issue was not even that the romance was poorly crafted or that the plot wasn't interesting, because I loved the idea of the plot. It was the comparisons that kept being made between Derek's paramour, I guess you could say, and Sarah. So at the beginning of the story, Derek is sleeping with a married woman. We characterize her as the villain of the story. She is very much the villain of the story, and that didn't really sit right with me. I think I could have overlooked it had Sarah not been used as a comparison to this paramour, to this mistress, I guess you could say. Sarah is supposed to be this like beacon of virginity and purity, and this is why Derek loves her so much. He's like, wow, she's just this angel in the flesh, and you know, I have to keep her from this world because she's too pure for it. I didn't like that. And it's weird too, because I'm not someone who is super upset anytime virginity is discussed, or if we have a virgin heroine. I don't think it's always a really big stereotype or trope. Like, I don't think it's the worst thing ever to portray in stories, because obviously, like, virgins exist in the world. I didn't like the way that misogyny kind of like raised her ugly little head here. I wish we had had a different conflict in this story, and that Sarah could have been liked for more than just the purity of her personality, I guess you could say, or of her being. I don't know. Regardless, I didn't love it. I wanted to love this book so much. There was so much promise there. All of my friends seemed to like it, but it was just a disappointing read to me. So those are my 6 most disappointing reads of 2021. Let me know in the comments down below how you felt about these books, if you have read any of them. I always like to hear conflicting opinions. It makes me kind of rethink some of mine, so maybe you'll give me a fresh perspective on some of these reads. Also, let me know in the comments down below what your most disappointing book was of 2021, so that I can either find out for myself or avoid these titles. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I love y'all so much, and until tomorrow.